Hi, good afternoon. I'm Harvey Belovski, Senior Rabbi of the Goldschmidt Synagogue, and we are back with the second instalment of Pesach Shiurim. First, last week, we spoke a little about the tensions that made a great Seder, and please God, next week we'll talk about something which is relevant for the end of Pesach, as we will only be past the Sedorim. But this week, the middle session is called The Seder in Bnei Brak and a Hidden Polemic. And I'll explain what I mean. One of the most well-known stories, perhaps in the whole of Jewish literature, is a story of 5 rabbis sitting at their Seder at Bnei Brak. And we're going to explore what that story means, where it came from, and what it's actually for. In order to do that, we have a source text, which I hope you can see. I'll be scrolling through it. Most of the texts are in English as well as in Hebrew. And we begin with a section, actually in 3 parts, from the Haggadah, with which you know. Immediately after Manish Tana, and we spoke a little about this last week, we have the section that begins Avodim Hoyinu Lefarav Mitzrayim. So the answer to the question is whether the night is one of celebration or commemoration is, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, Vayotzienu Hashem Elokeinu Misham, and the Lord our God brought us out from there, B'yod Chazoko U'B'Zora Natuya, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. V'Ilu Lo Hotzi HaKadosh Baruch Hu Es Aviseinu Mitzrayim, and had the Holy One, blessed is He, not brought our ancestors from Egypt, Hare Onu Uvonenu V'Nevonenu, behold, we and our children and our descendants, Mushubodim Hoyinu Lefarav Mitzrayim, would have remained enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. That's really the answer to the question. Now the bit that's tacked on, which leads us into the story, which is so familiar. Va'afilu kolonu chachomim, even if we're all wise, kulonu nevonim, all people of discernment, kulonu zakenu, all elders, kulonu yodim es haTorah, all people who know the Torah, mitzvah oleinu l'sapi b'tzias Mitzrayim, it's nonetheless a mitzvah that devolves upon us to recount the story of the Exodus. This means to me that the story is not about acquiring knowledge. Someone who fits any of these categories isn't going to be surprised about any detail, isn't going to be astonished to hear that there were frogs and lice. They know all this already. It is not about the acquisition of knowledge. It is about the replay of the experience. And therefore, however much you know, however experienced you are, however old you are, you have to tell the story. That's point 1. And point 2 is, V'chol hamarbe, the final line of this first paragraph, V'chol hamarbe l'sapi b'tzias Mitzrayim, and the more one tells the story of the Exodus, harizeh meshuboch, the better. You might need to think of what that means. Clearly, once you've told the story, there's not a lot of point in telling it again. So it might mean, as is common at long Sedorim, lengthy conversations about what each section means. It might be. But whatever it means, it's praiseworthy to take time doing the story and do it for longer than is strictly necessary. And having told us those points, the Haggadah now illustrates them with the following story, which you'll see in bold on the sheet, which is here on the screen, and is also available from the United Synagogue and can be circulated for those who wish to receive it. Maaseh Rebbe Eliezer, and you can see straight away if you understand the connection, this is a story. These are the great sages of a generation. They are sitting at a Seder in Bnei Brak, the hometown of Rabbi Akiva. This is almost certainly during the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s, which led eventually to the death of Rabbi Akiva and so many others. And they're in hiding on the run from the Romans. They don't have to do this. They're probably exempt from the mitzvah. They are great sages of great wisdom. And not only do they do it, but they tell the story all night, as you can see, therefore, to illustrate both points made at the end of the previous paragraph. Maaseh Rebbe Eliezer, Rebbe Yeshua, Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, Rebbe Akiva, Rebbe Tarfon. There was an occasion that Rebbe Eliezer, Rebbe Yeshua, Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, and Rebbe Akiva, and Rebbe Tarfon, show Mesubim of Bnei Brak. They were all reclining, it means at their Seder, in Bnei Brak. Probably not exactly the contemporary Bnei Brak, but much in the same area. In ancient times, Bnei Brak was an important Torah town as it is today, and Rebbe Akiva was the Rav. V'ayimesaprim b'tzias Mitzrayim, and they were telling the story, Kol Oisa Halayla, all night. Until their students came and said to them, Rabbi Seinu, our teachers, he gives an unclear Shema Shel Shachris. The time for saying the Shema in the morning has arrived, meaning the night's past. There are now other obligations. There are new religious obligations which will now supersede the story There's lots of speculation. Why don't they know themselves? Maybe they're so absorbed in the story they don't notice it gets light. More likely, they are underground, and therefore it requires someone from outside to tell them that the night has ended and the morning has come. That's the story. And we're going to focus on the meaning of this story. Now, just as part of the same section, and they're really three related texts, you'll notice that we mentioned here a great sage called Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who was a sparring partner in many of the laws of Pesach with Rabbi Akiva himself. They disagreed about about core details. And having mentioned Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who had, as in some places in the relevant tractate, the audacity, the confidence to argue with the great Rabbi Akiva, we learn something about him and a law related to Pesach. And you can see, and we're going to come back to this, that ostensibly it's just a continuation. We mentioned Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah here, and we continue. Omer Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, while we're mentioning Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah as one of the 5 rabbis at Bnei Brak, he said as follows: Hari ani kaven shirim shono. I'm like a man of 70. It's understood to mean he was a young man, but he was in a position of great authority at a young age, and there are even suggestions that he prematurely grayed to give him the gravitas required for a position of such importance. But as Ochisi, and I had not, it's often translated as merited, but I think the correct translation is, I had not been able to work out, I had not been able to come across, succeeded perhaps, in working out, the biblical derivation for the obligation to mention the Exodus daily at night, which we do by saying what we call the 3rd paragraph of the Shema. So you should notice that this paragraph is not about Seder night. It's about mentioning the Exodus as part of one's daily religious obligations, which we do by saying what we call colloquially the 3rd paragraph of the Shema. I wasn't able to work out the biblical derivation. I knew it was the right thing. I had a tradition, you should do it, but I couldn't find the verse that told me to do it. Ad Shadorasha ben Zoma, until Ben Zoma was a Julius sage. He's not even called Rebbe. Shenem, as the verse says, Lamantis, in order that you should recall the day of your coming out from the land of Egypt, all the days of your life. Now, there are 2 ways to read that phrase. Does all the days of your life, meaning all parts of the day? The days of your life means just during the day. Mention the Exodus every day. All parts of the days of your life, mention it in the night as well. And that, says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, I learned from the junior sage Ben Zoma, and I know now the biblical derivation of the obligation to mention the Exodus night and day. The Chachamim, I remember the rabbi says inside, there's a disagreement. They don't read that verse like that. Of course you should say it every day. But you might have thought that when the final redemption, the Messianic period arrives, the Exodus becomes so secondary, there would be no obligation to mention it at all. They really know the days of your life, your present life as it is now, in the non-redeemed world. But all the days of your life means all eras of history, even after the final redemption in the Messianic era. So there's a disagreement between Ben Zoma, cited by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and the sages as to what this verse means. Does it mean you should mention the Exodus both at the night and day, or does it mean even in the post-redemption era as well as now in the pre-redemption era? Now, the reason I brought this is because this is essentially a halachic discussion. This is not telling the story at all. It is a conversation about the laws governing how to mention the Exodus, when to mention the Exodus. It's not even about the Seder. It's about the daily mitzvah of mentioning the Exodus. Why is it there? And how does the passage flow? The answer to that question is related back to our story. Remember the story which I have in bold here, the story of the 5 rabbis in Bnei Brak, which led us into this paragraph. In the Tosefta, which is a text less well known, that is contemporaneous with the Mishnah, there is a slightly different version of the story. Let's read it, it's very short. Maisa b'Rabban Gamliel Zakenim. There was an occasion when Rabban Gamliel and the elders, that they were reclining at the house of Baisus ben Zonim in Lod. Lod is now a town in Israel close to Ben Gurion Airport. And they were occupied with the laws of Pesach. all night until cockcrow. So it's possible it's a different story, but there are many similarities. And of course here, Rabbi Gamliel is not one of the rabbis in this story. Here, Rabbi Gamliel is the lead rabbi and the other elders are not mentioned, but they're reclining in Lod, which is close to Bnei Brak, and they're busy with something all night until the cock crow, when they realize it was now morning and time to stop. It appears to be a variation on the very famous story that we know much better, the one that appears in the Haggadah itself. But the key difference for me is this. In our Haggadah, it says they told the story. They told the story of the Exodus all night. In the version in the Tosefta, they were learning the laws of Pesach all night. Now, to some degree, that answers my question. Once you've told the story, is there any purpose in saying it again? No. What it means is to study the laws, but they're quite different constructs. Let's explore. Now, the origin of the passage here, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, working out the biblical derivation of this rule to mention the Exodus every night, actually originates in the Mishnah at the end of the first chapter of Brachos, which is the first tractate in the Mishnah and the Talmud. Mazkirin Yetzias Mitzrayim ba'leilos. We mention the Exodus at night, and then it launches into the section that we've just quoted above. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, I am like a man of 70 years. So there's something slightly odd about this. The illustration is not actually Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah talking about the Exodus at all. He's talking about the laws surrounding the Exodus, and it's presented, in fact, in a legal context in Brachos. Now, I'm going to introduce you to two of the greatest academic Haggadahs ever produced, the very famous Daniel Goldschmidt Haggadah. Goldschmidt was an academic who wrote a number of works, and he wrote a superb version of the Haggadah, which talks about the issues. It's from a more academic perspective. That is, I think, written possibly in the 50s or the 60s. So Goldschmidt has to say about this. Shema bikshu orchei Haggadah lahatim escholas hasipur al yedei ma'aser shehoyo. It is possible that the editors of the Haggadah wanted to justify. Lahatim really means to make flavoursome, but I think it means to justify or to vindicate the obligation of telling the story through a real event. It's not good enough just to say you must tell the story. You must tell the story well and properly. You must tell it at length. The best way to persuade your public that this is something to be taken seriously, say, look at these great rabbis, people we revere, people we hold in the highest esteem. They did it, in which case we should certainly do it. So the Orchei Haggadah, the editors, have, if you like, an agenda. And the agenda is to persuade the public that this is an important mitzvah. And the way to do that is by creating or using a story. And it is possible that this story is actually not a standalone text, but it is merely an introduction to what follows. What follows? You might have thought you should do it from Rosh Chodesh. No, when do you do it? Not from the beginning of Nisan, but only from the 15th of the Matzah and Norah there. That's about not telling the story. That's about when to tell the story. Then you've got the 4 sons, which we're going to look at in a moment. The 4 sons are really identifying the fact that the Torah mentions the requirement to tell the story 4 times, perhaps 4 different ways, depending on the type of child. So, i.e., the story must be tailored, must be made bespoke for the child, depending on the child's capabilities. But again, that's to whom it should be done and how it should be done, but he's still not doing it. Once we've gone through all those texts, eventually becomes the story after the Hishonda. And to justify that explanation, that really the editors of the Haggadah are trying to introduce a construct, you need to understand you've got to tell the story at some length. Even though we've got all these halachic introductions, which are the why, how, who, and so on, here's a version of the story in the Talmud Yerushalmi, which is slightly different. Omar hen Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said to them. It's not a standalone text. He's talking to his 4 colleagues at the Seder in Bnei Brak. It's part of the same story. That word is very, very important. He said to them, I haven't highlighted it in the English. He said to them, I'm like a man of 70. So he said, And I might be technically an elder, a sage, a chacham, a novoin, all the categories that are mentioned, but I'm still learning something, and I still need to delve into the laws, and I still need to tell the story. And in fact, in the Rambam's text, the Rambam has a text of the Haggadah, which he prints that text, presumably the Rambam himself used and received from his forebears. The Rambam says, here's the text, Havodim Hoyinu, we were slaves, it's praiseworthy to repeat the story, Maisa, the story of the 5 rabbis, and then Omalohem Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah. Rebbe Elazar said to them, it's part of the same story. It's not some standalone occasion where we happen to mention Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, and now we refer to him again, as I suggested before. And look here, something even more radical. The 2 greatest early Haggadah texts we have are the text of the Rambam, which is not so different from ours, but much closer to the text that Sfaradim use, and the text of Sadia Goen, which is much earlier, and his Haggadah is shorter for people who like an early finish. Avodim hayidu lefara b'Mitzrayim, ve'etzim Hashem elokeinu misham b'yazakaz v'Turiah. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord our God brought us out from there with a strong-handed and outstretched arm. Ve'ilo go'al HaKadosh Baruch Hu es haviseinu Mitzrayim. And if God had not redeemed our ancestors from Egypt, already we and our ancestors, descendants, would have been slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt. Okay. Then it misses out all the rest of the story. It's not just our ancestors God brought out, but also us, something which we mentioned later. And then he goes straight to the 4 sons. Look at this, several paragraphs missing. No Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, Hare Ani Keven Shivim Shoma, I am like a man of 70 years. None of that. Just go straight to the 4 sons. So there seems to be a tension. This version of the Haggadah seems to be focusing quite a lot on the halachic stuff. Right? Doesn't seem to worry it seems to go straight to the 4 sons. We don't illustrate the need to tell the story at length. That's missing. The story of the 5 rabbis in Bnei Brak, and Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah quoted from the Mishnah in Brachos about when you should tell, how we know from the Bible you should mention the Exodus at night. All that's missing, and Sadia goes straight to the 4 sons. Now, a little bit about the 4 sons. I'm just going to read this section in English so we don't get too bogged down in the text. There is a section in Devarim, chapter 6 of Deuteronomy, when in time to come your children ask you what mean the decrees, laws, and rules that the Lord our God has enjoined upon you. You may recognize some of these verses. They're cited at the Seder. You shall say to your children, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. The Lord wrought before our eyes marvelous and destructive signs and portents in Egypt against Pharaoh and all his household. And he freed us from there that he might take us and give us the land that he had promised on oath to our fathers. Then the Lord commanded us to observe all these laws, to revere the Lord our God for our lasting good and for our survival, as is now the case. It will be commanded, therefore, to our merit before the Lord our God, to observe faithfully his whole instruction as he has commanded us. A slightly archaic translation, but it does the job. Now, just to give you some sense of where all this comes from, these various presentations here, you present the text in a very sophisticated way. Elsewhere, the child just says Marzois. Elsewhere, there isn't a question at all. And by careful contrast and comparison, we end up with 4 children. Not that the wise son, wicked son are mentioned explicitly in the Torah, but by a process of elimination and comparison, the rabbis come up with at least 1, if not 2 ways to understand it. And this is one example. There's a Mechilta to Rebbe Yishmael, which is a text from the Mishnaic period, which is really the basis of our 4 sons. There is a different version in the Yerushalmi, which we're going to see as well, or just mention as well. As you can see, I'm not going to discuss it in any great detail. I'm interested, there's a conversation. What do you say to the wise son? When you go to all the laws, you go right to the end. What's the last law? You shouldn't eat anything after the Afikomen or after the Pesach offering in temple times. I'm interested in this section, which is I've translated here. Having told you all about the sons and who to say it, here's a conversation. Dova Ache, another reading, and if you're following the English, it's this section here. Ma Eidos Vachukim. Remember the passage, what are these testimonies and statutes? A verse you know because it's cited in the passage of the wise son in our Haggadah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Minayin Ata Omer, Rabbi Eliezer said, from where do you know? How do you know that if your Seder comprises of a group of sages or scholars, that you need to occupy yourself in the laws of Pesach until midnight? Therefore it says, Maha Eidos. Eidos mean laws of testimony. Chukim, statutes. Mishpotim, social laws. These are legal constructs. They're not about the story. I hope you're beginning to see that there is a tension in these sources between what the objective of the Seder actually is. Is it to become proficient in the laws? And the more scholarly you are, the more likely it is you might read the story quickly, get it done in a few minutes, and then open your tractate Pesachim and have like a shiur about various rules and laws, perhaps some that are relevant today, maybe some about the Pesach offering that we don't have anymore. Or is the Seder effectively experiential? And even if you're wise, even if you're a sage, even if you're a person with great understanding and great discernment, you are required to spend your evening, perhaps the whole night, talking about the story, replaying it. It is experiential. And that tension exists in early sources. And we're going to suggest that the story of the five rabbis in Bnei Brak has made it into our Haggadah in its particular form to make a political polemic point. Because the view that you should spend your Seder primarily telling the story in an experiential way has won the day. Let's look at a couple more sources. We're quite near the end of the sources. We have a few more minutes. Here is another Tosefta. Another source. One is obliged to learn to occupy oneself in the laws of Pesach all night. So perhaps you should tell the story quickly and then delve into the laws. Even just with one's child. Even if one is alone. Even if you're one with one's disciples. That's what you should do. All night. There's a tension you see. All night is really Rabbi Akiva, who said the time for Pesach is all night. And you saw here earlier that in this version, Rabbi Eliezer seems to follow the view of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, that the whole thing is restricted to halachic midnight. But be as it may, it takes much, much less time to tell the story. What are you actually supposed to be doing with the core time of the Seder? Learning the laws? Shall I give a shiur to my family on Pesachim, the tractate, or shall we be telling the story and throwing frogs at each other? And again, to validate this other view, here is an excerpt from the section from the Yerushalmi, the Talmud Yerushalmi. You remember that the wise son says you should tell him all the laws of Pesach. He doesn't say you should go into the story. And this comes here. What you do, and even a foolish son. Here we have tipesh mahu omer. We don't use the word tipesh. It's a bit politically incorrect. It means a fool. So rather than Tam, the simple son, the Yerushalmi had tipesh. What does he say? Malzos, what's this? What you should say? Limdu hilchos ha-Pesach, teaching the laws of Pesach. Don't tell him a nice story. Tell him that he's got to eat matzah, and matzah's made like this. And when the Pesach offering was brought, it was a lamb made like... Teaching the laws. Can you see that there is an existential conflict between early sources as to what the primary objective of Seder night actually should be? Now, I promised you before, and we are very near the end, we're on the last source, to introduce you to two great academic Haggadahs. We've met Daniel Goldschmidt, and now we're going to meet David Henschke. David Henschke published a book about 5 years ago, a 400-page academic work on the Haggadah. It is absolutely superb. It's called Manishtana. It's a very creative name. And David Henschke, who actually visited the UK the year the book was published, I had the privilege of hosting him for dinner, so we've had a chance to talk about this. He did ask if fortunately I bought the book before I met him. And he says the following, and only a frum academic could say this, called Piska Zoi. Again, I'm sorry about this. Let's just read it in English. This entire section, that's the story of the five rabbis, does not appear in the Haggadot of the land of Israel, nor in the Haggadah of Rav Sadia Gaon. He's an academic, he's done a survey, comparative data. And we already saw, I brought you the Haggadah of Rav Sadia Gaon, which does not include the story of the five rabbis, and those with him mean those who follow that tradition. Nonetheless, academics have already noted that the conceptual purpose of this section is to justify the principle that even great scholars should only occupy themselves on this night with the story of the Exodus and not with the laws of Pesach. This appears to have been a very, perhaps quite feisty disagreement between the sages, maybe in the Mishnaic, pre-Mishnaic or post-Mishnaic period. And the inclusion of this section is a polemic which is to, as it were, to close the argument about the purpose of Seder night. If Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Yeshua, if they spend their night telling the story rather than learning, even though they knew the story, then we must too. And then he makes that one observation, which I do want to read in the Hebrew. Vehinei, ha'maisa b'chameshes ha'chachomim, the story of the five rabbis, Ein Motzi b'shum mokim b'sifras Chazal, does not appear in any rabbinic literature. The Haggadahs Bavel He Makor Yechidi, the Haggadahs that come from the Babylonian tradition, are the sole source. Hilkach, and that's out. Hilkach nechlik or hachoikrim in yesh rois boy makor tanai utenti. And therefore, the academics disagree as to whether this is in fact an authentic source from the Mishnaic period. And you can see what Henschke has done here. This disagreement is the sages of Eretz Yisrael. We don't even have it in the Haggadah. For the sages of Eretz Yisrael, the purpose of the Seder is primarily learning the laws. And for the sages of Babylon, perhaps were more distant from the source of Jewish life, it's about recreating and re-experiencing the story. And according to Henschke, it's inserted by the Haggadah. Then he says something even more controversial, with which we're going to end. Consideration of the details of the story, its phraseology, appear to suggest that they may be referring to a manufactured story. The phrase "story of the Exodus" is not found anywhere in the rabbinic literature. It's a much later story. The phrase "L'sapir b'tzias Mitzrayim," that phrase to tell the story of the Exodus, is not a phrase that's contemporaneous with the Mishnah. It's a later text. Furthermore, the phrase "all that night," they told the story "Kol Osa Halayla," only appears in Amoraite. That's Mishnah. That's post-Mishnaic literature, and this is claiming to be in the Mishnaic period in the 130s, but not at all in the literature of the Mishnaic sages. It seems that from here also, meaning from his philology, his digging around in the language, that this is not referring to an authentic Mishnaic story. So it's radical. Henschke is suggesting it's a great story. It's an adaptation of an original story in the Tosefta. But the Tosefta, as you might remember, I'm scrolling back to it now, told about a story of Rabban Gamliel and his fellows in the house of Baishas ben Zunin in Lud, and they learnt the laws of Pesach all night. According to Henschke, this has been adapted by the sages of Babylon to create a sense of reality around their insistence that the objective of the Seder is to tell the story. It doesn't matter if you know it. It doesn't matter if you're a great sage. It doesn't matter if you know all the details. It doesn't matter if you can't find anything new. It's about re-experience. It's about engaging. As the Rambam says in his version, the God of Chayav Odom Laharis is Atzma Ki'ilu Hu Yotzim Mitzrayim. One is obliged at the Seder, not as the Ashkenaz Haggadah says, lirois, as to see oneself, mean to imagine. Laharis means to behave as though one is leaving Egypt. The requirement that the Haggadah should be, at Seder night, should be an experiential rather than intellectual experience. That is a discussion that was won in ancient times by the inclusion of this story, whether authentic or not, and has guided the way we observe Seder ever since. Thank you.